Tonight's learning is dedicated to the Refuah Shalema for David Nisim ben Rachel. So have that in mind for the learning. And without any further ado, Rabbi.
I'm going to speak about tonight about something which will be in 1 week, Tisha. What exactly is the essence of Tisha? The obviously essence, the main concept of Tisha is mourning. You mourn. That's really what Tisha is about. It's an Avedus, and the entire Jewish nation mourns. What do they mourn? They mourn the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple. And we all know, especially in Yerushalayim, we can really identify with it much greater than America. I'm from part of the year in America. But here you actually have what's called the Mourning Mikdash, the place of the Mikdash, because there's no longer any Beis Hamikdash. You have it here, so you can really identify in many ways. You can actually see it physically what is missing. So we don't have that ability in America. But here, if you go there, you could see the actual absence of the Beis Hamikdash. But what is important is, in order to mourn, you obviously have to know, well, what are you mourning? Mourning, when you mourn, what is it for? It's fundamentally for some type of a loss. That's why you mourn. You're somebody, God forbid, who lost a parent, or whatever, a close relative, a wife, whatever. So the person mourns. The person mourns because the person experiences the absence of the person that they mourn for. If you don't experience an absence, you don't mourn. You may go through the motions of mourning, right? But you don't mourn. You can only mourn for something that you can clearly feel the absence and how that absence will impinge on your life. That's when you can mourn. So clearly then, the question is, what do we mourn for? And that's very important, again, to know. Like I said, because mourning can only be on something that you experience the loss. We mourn for many things, but really to understand the loss, you have to really be into hashkafa, because hashkafa tells you what the essentiality of what the Beis Hamikdash was. So let's just go through what's called a list, at least a list of what we mourn and why. The first thing we mourn, which is really the greatest loss of all, is the presence of God, Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is gone. It left. Whatever that means. I mean, God doesn't literally leave because He, as it says in the davening, it says, "Moli kol ha'aretz kavodai." The earth is filled with the presence of God, the presence of God. So therefore, obviously, that's the case. God never really leaves. But what He did leave is He left our ability to experience Him, to contact Him in a certain way. And that's the greatest part of mourning. What does it mean that God leaves? What does that do to us? Well, imagine, you come to the Beis Hamikdash, okay, you're in Yerushalayim, and you want to daven mincha, right? So you go to the Beis Hamikdash. I'm sure there was a shul in the Beis Hamikdash. There was everything else there, the Sanhedrin and so on. So what do? You go to a shul near the Beis Hamikdash and you daven. Could you imagine davening mincha or ma'ariv in the presence of God Himself? Because that is not a hyperbole. The presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Beis Hamikdash can actually be felt. It's not something, you couldn't see it, but you could actually feel it. Now, we don't know what that means. We don't know what it means to feel God. But you could feel God because His presence was there. It's a very real experiencing. And we don't have that anymore. So imagine you daven mincha, or you say Tillim. Anybody can go up there, right, and say Tillim. And you're actually feeling you're in the presence of God. You're in His house. That's why it's called the Beis Hamikdash, the house of the Mikdash, the house of the residence of God. Now, why would God want that? It's a different story. But what the Baruch Shem did is gave Klal Yisrael an incredible gift. And that is, it's not, for instance, if you do, let's say you do the mitzvah sukkah. So you eat in the sukkah. Okay? But God is not in the sukkah, really. I mean, let's see one of these Kedusha, where you can see Eliyahu in the sukkah. It's a different story, okay? For them, sukkah is a different experience. But for the average person, you go in the sukkah, what's that to do with God? It's a mitzvah. But it doesn't in any way, incur the presence of God. But the Beis Hamikdash wasn't that. He was there. It's a tremendous idea to think about that. And therefore, the equivalent of that is to go into the house of God, right, and talk to Him. Tefillah. In fact, the Chazal, you see the importance is now that we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, so what Chazal, the rabbis did, is they gave us an equivalent to the Beis Hamikdash, which is what? Which is Tefillah. Why? Because if you think about it, when you daven, you're davening to God directly. Because you say, Baruch Atah, blessed are you. You're not saying Baruch Hu, blessed is He. You see? So Tefillah is a type of experience, a mitzvah, where you are talking to God directly. You see, it's not referring about Him, you're talking to Him. It's called communications. The equivalent of that is Beis Hamikdash. Because in the Beis Hamikdash, you also were bringing korbanos to God. You see, that's why Tefillah and the Beis Hamikdash, or the korbanos, the whole kachim, right, is equivalent. That's why one can substitute or supplant for the other. It's a very important distinction. Every mitzvah you do is about God or because of God, but it's never to Him. But Tefillah or the Beis Hamikdash is to God. Tremendous difference. And that, for Klal Yisrael, is a tremendous chus, to be able to connect to God directly. Well, that's the first loss. We don't have that anymore. Second idea, the Chazal tell us in Pirkei Avos that you could witness 10 miracles that were clear miracles. You couldn't explain anything about it, only in the sense of a miracle. So therefore, if you had doubts, well, does God exist? Is He around? And so on. You just go to the Beis Hamikdash and see the Nes, for instance. Imagine, just some Nisim, right? All of a sudden, there's a tremendous wind in Jerusalem, right? And we know that on the top of the Mizbeach, they burnt the Mourning, and so the meat and so on. It's called the sacrificial parts. And of course, there was smoke rising. No matter how, a hurricane can go through that Beis Hamikdash. Yet the rising smoke would only go vertical. It would never incline, or else it would dissipate, That's a Nes, you see. And that was clear. You looked, it's impossible. Not only that, if you think about it, also, the Beis Hamikdash was primarily a humongous butcher shop. If you really think about that. I mean, in Pesach alone, they bought tens, hundreds of thousands of korbanos. Imagine the amount of animals and meat that was being slaughtered, then people were eating it and so on and so forth, right? So what do you find in a butcher shop? Flies. They're all over the place. And it's one thing to say, well, the butcher shop is closed. But the Beis Hamikdash was open, right? So you'd think you'd find, this would make an exterminator, this is the Olam Haba of an exterminator. Think about that, right? All these flies, right? Nothing. There wasn't one fly in the entire Beis Hamikdash area. And you know how much blood there was? In fact, you have to take the blood, you cut the neck, take the blood, and of course you sprinkle it on the Mizbeach. It was astounding that there were no flies or any type of insect in the entire Beis Hamikdash, you see. But in any case, and there are many miracles. So the second thing we are missing is an incredible validation of the presence and the existence of God. We don't have that today. Today you have there's a Kiruv movement, right? Kiruv movement, right? So you're trying to prove that God exists and so on. You just take them on a fast trip to the Beis Hamikdash. You walk in, and after 1 hour, I'm a believer. Sure, we don't have that today. So that's the first, at least the first or the second idea of what we missed. The second idea, like I said, is that you were able to pray in the presence of God. What a kedusha. In other words, when you did the avodah, which is the service to God, the mitzvahs, you were able to do it with an incredible experiencing of being close to God. We don't have that today. What a loss. Then there were other things. Nevuah, prophecy. Prophecy ended, right, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. What is prophecy really? You know, we know that prophecy, we know the Nevi'im, Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, and Cheskel, and so on, all the Nevi'im, Toyoso. But what is prophecy? Well, we live on earth. Therefore, what does that mean? That means we can experience physical things, right? But you can't experience God in His abode. You cannot experience angels because they are in a dimension called the spiritual dimensions, which is far beyond us. But a Novi was able to do that. Nevuah is what's called where you can transcend the body, but not leave the body. Where what would happen is that the Shekhinah would send forth a force. You'd have to do the right procedures, obviously. You know, there were many schools in Nevuah in Israel at that time, so you could become a professional prophet. I don't mean Wall Street either. But anyway,
For profit.
that's for profit, yeah. You know, but if you did it successfully, Sheamus, Kabbalah, and so on, you know, what would happen is that the Shekhinah would send forth a force that would impinge and go down and impinge on your imagination. And on your imagination, you could see a movie, and that movie is what a Navi saw. But that new movie was on the imagination, and without going into the whole process, but he would be able to see communications with God, literally, directly. You see, but we don't have Nevuah. We don't have prophecy anymore, which is we cannot even imagine the spiritual heights that a Navi had. Imagine seeing, and he would be able to talk to angels, and so on. We have this in the Chazal, by Yom Kippur, with Rabbi Shmuel, and so on. Many things that allude to this phenomenon. You know, so we lost that, and of course, you know, we lost many other things. There was political independence and so on. But the ruchnius that we lost, we cannot imagine what it was like at the time. And besides, it was an incredible place of unity. Could you imagine on every Yom Tov, let's say Pesach or whatever, you'd have a million Jews coming up to that place. Could you imagine how many Jews there were? And the experiencing of achdus, of unity among the Jewish people at that point. And all of them surrounded the Beis HaMikdash, right? And focused on it. What an incredible sense of achdus, of unity that the Jews had. And Avos Yisrael. But we don't have that, because we don't have a center anymore. The only thing we have now, basically, is a shul, Beit Knesset. It's called the Mikdash Ma'at, small Beis HaMikdash. Now you understand why. Because the tefillah is connected korbanos. The tefillah is an equivalence of korbanos. So therefore this shul, where they daven, is called the Mikdash Ma'at, a small Beis HaMikdash. And of course, instead of the Oren, you have, of course, the Sefer Torah, and so on. And therefore that serves as a center or gathering of the Jewish people. You know, each shul has its own membership, its own minyan, and so on, you know. But could you imagine when all the Jews gathered in one shul called the Beis HaMikdash? That's something to think about. And then if you think about it, you begin to appreciate the loss, what we really lost, and so on. In any case. Now the question that we have to ask, now that we understand what the loss is, to some extent, the question is, what does that have to do with us? That Beis HaMikdash was destroyed 1,948 years ago. It was destroyed in 70 CE, some people say 68, whatever it is. But it's 1,948 years. It's a long time ago. Now, they destroyed it for whatever reason, because of Lashon Hara, or because of Sinas Chinam. What does that have to do with us? Are we commemorating the Beis HaMikdash? What's a commemoration? Where you remember, it's like Thanksgiving in America, you know? The turkey that you're eating, of course, is supposed to be for commemoration, not because you want the turkey, right? But in any case, you commemorate something that was, you know, and sort of like to bring it in your memory to remember the events that occurred in the past that are significant, you know? So why are we at all engaged in Tisha B'Av? That's the question. They caused it. They had the Sinas Chinam, right? They had the Lashon Hara, those things that caused the destruction. The question is, what does that have to do with us? Are we commemorating it? And the answer is, Jews don't commemorate anything. We are mourning because we caused the destruction, not them. There's a famous Yerushalmi that says, Kol mot kol b'kol shono. Every year, the Kol Dor actually says, every generation, that the Beis HaMikdash was not built, okay? It's as if the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. It's Yerushalmi. What does that mean? If it wasn't built in our generation, then it is our generation that destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, not the generation of the 1,948 years ago. We destroyed it. What does that mean? And the answer is a very interesting concept. We think that, well, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, it's historical, okay, what can you do? But that's false. Because every time Tisha B'Av rolls around, let's say Rosh Chodesh Av, there's this huge Din Torah in Shemayim. Yeah. Should we rebuild the Beis HaMikdash or not? It's actually a Din Torah, our entire sitting of Beis Din in Shemayim, in heaven, the heavenly tribunal, that judges, can we rebuild the Beis HaMikdash? You see. Now, so what do? They are now presently judging this. So what do? They take a look at Klal Yisrael of that year, you see. What happens? They take a look at Klal Yisrael. Then, which means now, on Friday, Rosh Chodesh Av, there was this Beis Din sitting, like 3 days ago, correct? Should we rebuild it or not? Yes, that's how recent it was. So they took a look around, and of course, and the Sultan was a great prosecuting attorney, said, of course not. You have any idea how many Jews hate one another? How many Jews dislike one another? You see? Or how many Jews are not interested in the welfare of any Jew? You see? You have any idea how much Lashon Hara is spoken? You see, that's what the Sultan would say. So Beis Din would examine the evidence, and they'd say, you're right. So therefore, we will not build the Beis HaMikdash. Well, in the time that the Beis HaMikdash was built, I was standing, so the Gzar Din, the decree, would be, it must be destroyed. It cannot exist, you see? But today, the Gzeira, the decree is, not that it can't be, not that it has to be destroyed, because it's not standing. It cannot be built. It's an equivalence. In other words, the essential idea is that there cannot be a Beis HaMikdash. So if it's standing, the Gzeira is, it's destroyed. But if it's not standing, the Gzeira is, it can't be built. Yeah, but it can't be built, why? Not because of something that happened 2,000 years ago. Because the din now is that it cannot be built. Why? Because the same reasons. Senas Chinam, baseless hatred, and Lashon Hara. You see? So therefore we destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, not 2,000 years ago. That's the mistake people make. When we mourn, we are mourning because we have contributed to the destruction of the bayis. Except the form of the Gzeira is that it cannot be built, not that it has to be destroyed. And that's why when Jews sit and mourn Tisha B'Av, what they're really mourning is that they contributed in their own way to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. A very big difference in how many people think. Any case, so we basically mourn because of the tremendous loss, as I was saying, of what we experience. But there's something else that we have to understand about the Beis HaMikdash, which I've said at different times and so on. The question you have to ask is, okay, if the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, so what does that mean? It means we lose the presence of God. That's what it means. And that affects us in myriad ways, which I've explained. There's no nevuah, there's no prophecy, and many ideas and so on, But the question we have to ask is, what do you mean God? Where did God go? He left, we know that. There's an absence. But where did he go? That is the question. That's a very important question. It's not that he left. It's worse. Let me explain. Then you really begin to understand what the tragedy is of the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. It says a pasuk in the Torah, V'shov Hashem as Shuscha. God will return with your captivity. So the rabbis learn, the Chazal learn, it doesn't say Veheshev, and God will return your captivity. It means He will bring you back from captivity. It says V'shav, and He will return. So Rashi points out, right, that the Shekhinah itself will return with the Jews. That means the Shekhinah itself is in Golus. It's called Shechinta B'Galusa. The Shekhinah is in Golus. So therefore, obviously, if the Jews return, so does the Shekhinah. So the question is, what does that mean? What do you mean God is in Golus? How does God go into Golus? You know? A being that fills the presence of the entire planet doesn't go in Golus. It's all over. But it means something else. It means that the Rebbeinu Shalom has voluntarily allowed somebody else to take, to nourish from Him. The koyach of the Shekhinah, He has allowed somebody else to nourish from that koyach, and that being can now use that power, okay, from what's called yoni from the Shekhinah, to destroy the Jewish people. That's what it means. Now, what does that mean? So you have to know this fundamental relationship of what goes on. In the beginning, Adam HaRishon, okay, he was tested. He was tested to see would he eat from the tree or not. And who was trying to convince him? Who was trying to convince him? And the answer to that is, of course, the Nachash, the snake, the primordial snake. It's trying to convince Adam. However, he was successful. Adam HaRishon ate from that tree. And therefore, God approaches to Adam HaRishon and to Chava and so on, and says the following. Okay, here comes the judgment. Because you listened, you bought into the argument of the Satan, you must destroy him. Until now, your task was to avoid, to ignore his advice. That's your task. And thereby, you do many things. I'm skipping a lot of ideas and so on. But since you listened to him, what happened is you gave him existence of which he didn't have before. You see, when you buy into somebody's statement, what you do is you empower that person to exist more. So what you did is you empowered the Satan, and Nachash, the snake, is the mouthpiece of the Satan. You have now given much greater substance to the Nachash, or the Satan himself. And therefore, it is not enough sufficient where you now ignore the advice. You must kill the Satan. You must eradicate, demolish, annihilate evil. That's the new job. Very important. So of course, Adam is going to say, excuse me, how do I do that? How do I demolish an angel? That's the Satan. So what the Baruch did is an astounding thing. And it really conforms ultimately to justice. What he did is the following. How does everything exist? Everything exists because we are connected to God, let's say through an invisible cable. Everything is connected to God through this invisible cable, and therefore able to exist. Because you need what's called a shefa, the power, the influence of a kedusha. In Kabbalah it's called the sparks of holiness. You need that connection to God. That's how you exist, and that's how you maintain the existence. What God did is the following. So everything in existence is connected to God, or else it could not exist. Man is connected to God, Adam HaRishon. But so is the Malachim, so is the Satan. So what the Baruch did, he went over to, so imagine a cable that goes from God to you. It's invisible, right? So the Baruch went over to the Satan's cable, because he also has one, and he cut it. Now before the Satan died, because that's exactly what's going to happen, you know, he took the end of the cable that he cut from the Satan, and he connected it to Adam HaRishon. Interesting. So now the cable comes down and splits like an upside down Y. One side goes into the Adam HaRishon, and the other side goes into the Satan. You see, that's the shidduch. Now everybody's cable is automatically attached to the Satan. Now here's what happens. There's only enough energy, kedusha, that comes down. There's only enough to allow one side to really exist and flourish. There isn't enough for two. Obviously, what happens then is that now pits both of these individuals, right, into a combat. Who's going to get the goodies, the nutrition? as they say, because there's only enough on one side, you see. So here's the way it works. If Adam does the mitzvahs, does the will of God, so the power, the shefa, comes to him, he grows stronger, but he not only stronger, he becomes much more, he flourishes, becomes more productive, more healthy, and so on. If it's all going to him, what happens to the Satan? Well, the Satan gets weak because he's losing the energy. If Adam Rishon is able to take all the stuff from the cable to him, then the Satan dies, literally. See, that's how an Adam can kill the Satan. You just take all the power that God sends down, and you take it to your side, and the other side dies. What happens if Adam sins? Then that power goes to the Satan, not to Adam. And it's really justice, Mida Keneged Mida. You see, because the Satan says, God says, look, if you don't want me, so I'll give myself to him. Then he can empower himself. When a person does it with, so therefore what happens is, that's called Tikburis Ra, the enormous energy or proliferation of evil. But how does it work? Because Adam sins, and therefore the Satan is called, he's yonek. He nourishes from that Kedusha. That's the deal. Now, the Jewish people have replaced Adam Rishon. That's what's happened. Originally, Adam was supposed to do the tikkun, whatever, bring God down, and now the Jewish people do the tikkun. So, as a result of that, every Jew that lives is connected in a certain way to the Satan. And his acts determine which way the energy goes. That's what happens. So therefore, if a person has sorrows, evil in whatever, it is because his acts are found wanting, and he has allowed the Satan to be yonek from his Kedusha. That's the way it works. And because of that, the Satan is now incredibly empowered because of the incredible amount of divine energy that comes to the Satan. This is a very important relationship that exists. Everybody, most people, of course, are completely unaware of this, you see. But there's always somebody vying for your Kedusha. So that's the concept of Yanika. Well, the Satan can be yonek, depending on your acts. He can be yonek from the Kedusha that comes down to you, and he can take it. Of course, he's got to bring you to the best, and he's got to, you are judged, right? And then the Xera, the Dintura the Psak has to be from the best, and the heavenly tribunal, that you sin. Then and only then can he take it, you see. In any case, that is the important relationship between you and the Satan. Very important. Now, the problem is this. We need that Kedusha, you see. But it's more than that. The purpose of the Jew is to do what, ultimately, in reality? The purpose of the Jew is to bring God back to this world. God, on purpose, absented himself from this world. And the purpose of the Jew is to bring him back. How does he do that? Because when you bring down a certain amount of Kedusha, holiness, what that will eventually do is it will be mezakech the bria. It will purify physical matter and turn it into spiritual matter. It's called the transformation of material. That's what the Jew does. Whenever a Jew does a mitzvah, it's a credit. And at the time when it will work, which is Messianic era, then the Jew will have turned this world into Olam Haba, ultimately. Yes. The Jew creates Olam Haba because of the Kedusha that he brought down that purifies the physical world, and the physical world turns into a spiritual dimension. And it goes up and up through all the olamas until this world becomes Olam Haba. That's what happens. If anybody asks you, where is Olam Haba? And the answer is, it's here. It's here. Now, there's a lot of people out there say, you gotta be kidding. I don't have an Olam Haba. I gotta get in where I live. Whatever, right? But ultimately what happens is the mitzvah has the power to refine, purify physical matter. Not yet in the Yimasa Mashiach, but each one of us has what's called credits that will allow, it will be activated at a future time, you see. So that's the purpose of the Jew. It's called zikuch, to purify, and what that means is that the world will turn from a physical universe into a spiritual, higher and higher, until ultimately speaking, this world turns into Olam Haba, you see, which is a very important concept. So the question is, wait a minute, so then what's my job? The job is to bring down enough power, Kedusha, that will transform this world into the future world. That's the job. And of course, how do you do that? You do mitzvahs. Every time you do a mitzvah, it's a credit. And that credit ultimately, at some future time, will be part of the energy that transforms the entire creation, actually the entire physical universe, all 13.7 billion light years of it, for those who want to know the distance of one end to the other end. All of it will return and be transformed into a spiritual universe. That's what happens. But here's the problem. It's one thing if I do a mitzvah and I bring down this holiness, but what do I do with all the stuff that the Satan is yonik? He's got a whole pile of stuff that he took from all the Jews. You know? All the Jews had Rachmanis on the Satan, right? So they sinned, and they gave him some, we're a nation of Achnos Orchim, right? So what we did, he said, okay, you can eat too. You know? What do we do with all the stuff that he's got? So the idea, therefore, there are three ways to do the tikkun. And now you know what the tikkun is. The tikkun, how do we bring God back? By reversing the physicality of this world into a spiritual domain, and in the spiritual domain, God is present. So it's not that we bring him back, it's that we remove the barrier to his presence. That's the problem. God's presence is blocked by the incredible physicality and also the zoyama, the influence of the Satan, that when he's energized, he produces a tremendous tumah, pollution. That blocks the Shekhinah. So that's what happens. You remove that blockage and God is here. And that's what Zikach is really all about. So therefore, how do we bring back the stuff that he's taken? And the answer to that is that Tikkun therefore has three different ways. The first way is called mitzvahs. When you do a mitzvah, what happens is you have a credit where you can again retransform the world. But what do you do with all the energy, all the holiness, the sparks of holiness that the Satan has? Well, you do tshuva. Tshuva, repentance, is the second way of tikkun. When a person does tshuva, then the Satan is forced to relinquish all the stuff that he's taken from that person because of that particular avera. You see? You do tshuva. So he's forced to give it back to you. But what happens if a person doesn't do tshuva, right? So then what happens to all the stuff that the Satan has? The answer is yisura, suffering. Suffering is the device that can remove all the sparks of holiness, take it from the Satan, and bring it back to the Jew. Because suffering is an expiation, and it's also part of judgment, din. That's why we can get it back, you see. And that explains an enormous amount of ideas, what is going on. Now, I want to illustrate this with real life understanding. And what you can begin to understand is that the Churban is not just the Shekhinah left, the Beis HaMikdash. You see, here's the rule. Whatever we get and we give away to the Satan, he can be yonik from. This is the way it works. So, when the Beis HaMikdash was existing, yes, and the Shekhinah was there, so we were yonik from the Shekhinah. The power that we had, the Jews had at that time, was that they could take from the divine presence itself, the incredible holiness and energy from the divine presence itself, you see. But what happens if what? If we lose the divine presence? So the rule is, right, that if we're eating steak and we lose it, he gets steak, because he takes what we lost. If we're eating tuna fish, then all he gets is tuna fish, you see. What does that mean? If we lose the Shekhinah, so that means he can be yonik from the Shekhinah, because we lost it. That's what happens. When we lose something, he can take from whatever energy and holiness from that which we lost. That's measure for measure. That's called absolute justice. And therefore the Satan can be yonik from the Shekhinah. Very important concept. But to us that's devastating, because he now has the energy of the divine presence to destroy us. That's the real concept of Tisha B'Av, as you will see, which I will elaborate on. Okay? It's not that we lose the Shekhinah. It's that it's now in the hands of a being that wants to destroy us. You see? That's a double tragedy, which is very important to understand. Now, where did this happen? Can I give you, you can ask me, can you give me an illustration of this? And I will give you 3. Where you can actually see the transference of what happens when the Satan is yoine from the Shekhinah. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed how many years ago? 1,000, well, the first one was destroyed in 500 BCE, whatever, and so on, you know. So we're talking about 2,500 years, approximately, right? 2,400 years. That's a long time ago. Now, the question we know, what did we lose? We lost the divine presence, obviously, right? But now the question is, where do you go? We know where it went. That the Satan can now be unique from that Shekhinah, from the divine presence. But if the Satan can take from the divine presence, right? So how does it manifest itself here? What can he do? You see? So the answer to that is very interesting. What is the divine presence? The divine presence allows us to understand the essence of God. That's Nevuah. Nevuah is really where you actually contact, experience, and understand the divine itself. It's an incredible phenomenon, you see. So if the Satan can take from the divine presence, that means he can produce an understanding of God also. But not Judaism. It comes out as different religions. Yeah. In the old days, there used to be paganism, you know. But if he has access to the divine presence, that means he could take the knowledge of God and give it to the Goyim as religions. Now I'll show you something interesting. Right around the time we lost the Beis HaMikdash, within the 100-year period of when we lost the Beis HaMikdash, many of the world's religions were founded. Was that coincidence? What religions were founded? Okay? First of all, Lao Tzu, Taoism. He lived around the time of the destruction of the first temple. Buddha lived around that time also. Confucius was quite confused. He also lived around that time. You see, the major religions of the East were founded just around the time we lost the Beis HaMikdash. Was this an accident? But it's not just that. That's in the East. What about the West? Okay, most of the Greek philosophers lived right around that time, right? Archimedes was much later. Let's say Parmenides, right? Socrates, Aristotle, you see, Pythagoras, they lived approximately around the time of the destruction of the first temple. So the whole concept of Western thought, Western philosophy, which is the basis of modern civilization, started at the time that we lost the first Beis HaMikdash. In fact, you see that in the Pasuk in Eicha, which is very interesting. The Pasuk in Eicha, which we're going to read on Tisha B'Av, what does it say? It says, Soreha, right? Her princes, Umalkeo, and our kings, right? Bagoyim, are in the Goyim, right? Ain Torah. There's no more Torah, but Gam Neviel, and also the prophets, they don't see any visions or prophecy of God. What do you mean? There's ain't Torah. So when it says Sorel Makeh Goyim, it means that they have what we had. You see, that's the unique of the Satan. That the Satan is able to take what we have and give it to the Goyim, which means also known as the satanic influence, and they now have it, you see. So, therefore, you see that around the destruction of the first temple, that's when the Chochmah of the Goyim in the West and the religions of the Goyim in the East, they were founded right around that time. Is this a coincidence? It's incredible, convergence of Chochmah among the Goyim. No, it's ours, but they took it. Why? Because what the Gemara says, the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because Gila Raish, Vichastom, Abed Zorah, all the three Averis Chamuras. And therefore, the Satan was able to access it and, of course, flourish. And it comes out as religions or incredible understanding of truth if we lose the Shekhinah. Where do we see this? You know, it's a pasuk in Shachris. It says in Tachnun, the Jews have a certain gift when they have the Shekhinah. What is that? They have what's called Tiferes and Oiz. Tiferes is beauty and Oiz is might. What are these things? You see, Tiferes and Oiz. In fact, we say in the davening, Oizi Yisrael b'gvura, Oizi Yisrael b'gvura, But Oiti Yisrael B'Sifara, Tferes and Ois, V'uras Ois, and Tferes. What does that mean? Because the thing that signifies God mostly, the essential characteristics of God, is Tferes, is beauty. Beauty is Chochmah, unbelievable wisdom. The Ois is success. That's what might is. The ability to be productive, to be successful against all odds. So when God is present, we have those gifts. We have Tferes and Ois, you see. But what am I saying? That if the Jews sin, the Satan gets what? He gets the Tferes and Ois, doesn't he? And therefore in Shachris by Tachna, what do we say? Ad Mosai Uscha Bashvi. How long will your Ois will be in captivity? V'sif'altcha, and your beauty be atzo. You see, that's actually what we say. And that's the tragedy that we mentioned in Tachnan. It's a famous pasuk. Ad Mosai Uscha Bashvi, v'sif'altcha b'atzo. We lost the Tferes and Ois, and they get it. You see, that's the beginning of the incredible tragedy of what the Jews have experienced. So, that's the first idea, the first Beis HaMikdash. Well, the major religions of the world emerged because we lost it. Let's take a second look. When was the second Beis HaMikdash destroyed? Right? About 2,000 years ago. I said 1,948 years ago, right? Okay, you know the formula now, so let's do it, right? We lose the Shekhinah, gone, right? The Satan is Yoineg, and we lost the Shekhinah because of Sinas Chinam and Lashon Hara. That's the real reason why we learn it, and so on, right? So the Satan is Yoineg from the Shekhinah, right? Well, what's the formula? That if we lose the Shekhinah, what must emerge? Religion. The ability of going to access God. What religion emerged at the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash? And the answer is Christianity. That's where it comes from. Christianity is a very interesting religion, you know. It's called the Moshe Kapoy, for those who know Yiddish, you know. It's a fakert. It's a v'nahapoich. What does that mean? Here it goes, right? What do we say? We say that, right, we have the Torah. What do they say? New Testament, right? That's their replacement of the Torah. We say that what? We are Beis Yisrael. And what do they hold? They hold they're Jews. They hold that God switched. You know, us for them. It's called replacement theology. You know, they've been replaced. And we say that what? We have the Mashiach, and they say they have the Mashiach. You see, but what Christianity is nothing more than a theft of Judaism. In fact, what's interesting, if Judaism did not exist, neither could Christianity. Because the whole thing is based on Judaism. It's called the grand theft. And if you want to know how much they took from us, right? Even the Pope was a yarmulke. Think about that. What's he doing with a yarmulke? Did you ever see a Buddhist with a yarmulke? You know? Because really, Christianity, you see, you know, it's Judaism on its head is Christianity. That's really what it is. What Christianity fundamentally is, it's paganism with a Jewish veneer. That's what it is. I don't know the whole thing, but, and so on. What was that? Go for it. I should go for it, right? But that's what Christianity is. It's paganism with a Jewish window dressing. So it looks Jewish. And Paul did that. He was successful in that, you know, because he knew the Jews are not going to accept it. So what he did is he gave a Yiddish tam, you know, and so on, you know. But anyway, but again, Christianity is the transference that we lost. We lost the divine presence, so Christianity emerged, you see, and it's a major religion. But what I find incredible, right? Why did we lose the Beis HaMikdash? Because of Sinas Chinam and Lashon Hara, right? What is the greatest document ever written that is pure Moitzi Shemra and Lashon Hara against the Jews? The answer is the New Testament. So it's Mida Keneged Mida. That's what God says. You want to destroy my temple. You want me to vacate because of your Lashon Hara, right? Your Lashon Hara, right? And if I vacate, right, the Son's going to be yoinek from the Kedusha. So what are you going to get, right? Because of that, the Son's now going to take, he's going to eat off my holiness, right? So your punishment is that you have created a religion that is based fundamentally on the New Testament, which is total Lashon Hara and Moitzi Shemra. We suffer from the very religion we created. It's amazing when you think about that. And that's really what it is. The greatest tragedy of Jewish people is because of that New Testament, which has spoken so many lies. I'm not even going into Augustine and everybody else that really buried the Jews and what they call the Jews and so on and so forth, you see. So we're getting a good feel of this, that we now see transference. We actually see it really happening. Things that happen when we lose the Shekhinah. You see. I'll give you one more example. Okay? There's a thing called the creation clock. What is the creation clock? That the world was created in 6 days, and on the 7th day you have Shabbos. Therefore, the Gemara says that this world will last 6,000 years. Shisa alfei shnin hevo alma, the Gemara says. This world will last 6,000 years, or each one parallels 1 day of creation. 6 days, 6,000 years. Okay. So the Zohar says something very interesting. The Zohar says that in the beginning of the 6th day, which is Friday, right, which is the English year 1240. The year 5000 on the Hebrew calendar, right, the creation calendar, is the year 1240 in English. Okay? So the Zohar says, because it enters the 6th day, what's the 6th day? It's Erev Shabbos. So therefore the Messianic light begins to descend. That's what happens. Because we begin to think about Shabbos on the 6th day, right, Erev Shabbos, right, and it begins to descend. That's what happens. Because God always prepares for some type of time period that will come. 1240, the Messianic light. What is the Messianic light really? Well, the Messianic light is a very interesting phenomenon. The Messianic light is the ability to look at any chokhmah and to see down to its ultimate causes. That's what it is, you see. In other words, if you are looking at any type of physical phenomenon, you immediately understand what determines, what causes that phenomenon. It's like a magnifying glass. Whatever you put it on top of, you will magnify. You see, so the Or Mashiach, the Messianic light, is that ability. You put it on anything, any chokhmah you want to learn, and immediately you begin to discern what the ultimate causes are. It's called the internal structure of anything. Now, the question is, okay, the Zohar says, based on that if the Or Mashiach started coming down, what, in 1240, which is the year 5000, right? Because that's the beginning of the preparation of Shabbos, right? So what is the Or Mashiach then? So the answer is, in Judaism, it's Kabbalah. Because Kabbalah was began in 1240. The Zohar was discovered in 1292 by Moshe de Leon, whatever, and that became the real beginning of the study of Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? Kabbalah is the study of the spiritual worlds, the interface between God and the physical universe, and all the spiritual domains and dimensions, what's called the alamas and the spheres. That's really what it is. But aren't those things the determinant of physical world? Of course they are. So therefore, the beginning of Kabbalah began at the time that the Or Mashiach comes down. Because that's really what the Or Mashiach is. It's an understanding of the entire spiritual world. It's a complete understanding how everything physical really emerges from the spiritual world. You see. Aha! But here's the mystery. If the Jews sin, what happens? Something's yoinek. Right? So what does it look like if the Sultan takes the Or Mashiach? It's a good question. It's a good question. Because we know the formula. If we have something and we lose it, if we have the Or Mashiach coming down, what does that mean? It means the Shefa. There's a divine force or energy that allows us to see pnimius, internal structure of anything we decide to do. But if the Satan takes it, what does he do with it? The answer is, which is really fascinating, the Or Mashiach in the hands of the Satan is called science. Now, before you think I'm going to talk about science being devil worship, which of course it's not, you need to understand what that means. Remember what comes down. What comes down is the ability to understand at the deepest level, which is called the causation of something, right? Of any chokhmah you want. Okay. What is science really? Science is the ability to perceive, right, any chokhmah at the deepest level. For instance, if you're a biologist, you're into DNA, right? If you are a physicist, right, so you're into subatomic particles. So what science is a remarkable ability to look down into the ultimate causes and therefore predict or even shape what can happen. That's what engineering is, right? That's what science is. But science is not evil, it's chokhmah. It's the ability to look at the totality of a field, whatever that is, but at the deepest level, you see? So science in itself is incredible. It's the same concept, but it's the messianic light, which is the magnifying glass, applied to the physical world, not to the spiritual world. See, so we have it in Kabbalah, see, but they have it, as you will see, in the ability to understand the totality and the internal structure of anything. But science is like a knife. In the hands of a surgeon, what will it do? It will cure. But in the hands of a murderer, it will kill. So when the Satan is yoinik science, what is that? Yoinik the Mashiach. What that means is that he takes this and gives the world, the goyim, the ability to that they can look at any of their wisdom, you see, and be able to understand the internal structure of everything. But in the hands of a guy who wants to learn chokhmah, that's fine. But why would the Satan want to do that? Why would he give this power to look at wisdom in this way, which is okay? And the answer is a very interesting concept. The world was never atheistic until the advent of science. Because how could you explain all this, right? So there was no such thing as atheism in the ancient times. Everybody believed in God, one God, 50 gods, whatever it was. But there was no such thing as atheism in those days. Everybody worshipped and sacrificed to something. It is only with the advent of science that atheism came. And along came Darwin, who I always get a kick out of the fact that he was a minister, right? And Darwin enabled somebody to be an Epicurus. Never. You couldn't be an Epicurus. In the olden days, yeah, you could be even of a Zora, but you could not be an Epicurus. You see, you had to believe in a God, some supreme being, right? What enables mankind to discard God altogether? And the answer is science, because it enables a man to say, well, we know why things happen, we understand its causes, and that's why it happened, not because there's a God or anything like that. So that's what the Satan wants. He wants to use the science, the knife, not the cure, to see the chokhmah of God. When you study anything, medicine, biology, astronomy, immediately you're aware that this can't come by chance. How can this complexity come by chance? It's impossible. You see, you realize that immediately if you're honest, you know. But if you don't want to be honest, right, then you have something you can pin it on, and that is science. So what science is a beautiful instrument to become an Epicurus. That's what the Satan wants. Not interested in the chokhmah. He's not interested in giving the world incredible wisdom and to live more modern life or whatever. He wants to use science to be able to turn the world into atheists, especially the Jews. Because those are the guys who are always the focus of what he wants. And therefore that's what happens. So with the advent of science, now when did science begin? You know when it began? Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon lived in the year 1240, and he began the scientific method. And then 300-400 years later, it was graduated to Francis Bacon. They developed the scientific method. They got away from Aristotle, who just was an armchair, experiment, philosophy, scientist. So therefore, the scientific method, they broke away from Aristotle. You see, began at 1240. That's mamash, the Mashiach. That is the year 5000. So you had these things going on. You had the growth of Ruchniya, spirituality, Kabbalah. At the same time, you had the growth of science. You see, and they both began to grow because the Jews were giving. Finally, you get to the time where we have Shabtai Tzvi, which is 1670, 1680, and so on. And there was a tremendous amount of, even the Tisha said, Jews were speaking in shul without going into, and he said that's why you had the Chamelniki massacres and so on, and Shabtai Tzvi and so on at that time. But if that's the case, if the Jews are losing Kabbalah, and by the way, that's exactly what happened. There was a tremendous backlash against Kabbalah, because Shabtai Tzvi was a big Makubal. So they said that if Kabbalah could do this to a guy, we forbid anybody learning it, which is astounding. So the rabbis themselves rejected the origin of Judaism. Yeah, but what emerges? The other side. Who is the other side, right? The Sultan's taking science, because that's what science is when the Goyim, and they, so what is the manifestation of science if the Jews are really sinning, and it was so bad that the Gemelnik massacre, where almost half of Europe was wiped out. The greatest, besides the Holocaust, the greatest slaughter of Jews ever known is the Gemelnik massacres, and so on, in Europe. In any case, what is it? So out pops the father of modern science. Who's the father of modern science? Newton. Where does Newton come from? The concept, whenever we lose something, it always emerges on the other side in a very great way. So we get the Gemelnik massacres, we get the greatest false Messiah of all time, Shabtai Tzvi, right? Because obviously of whatever the sins of the Jews were that deserved that, and they get Sir Isaac Newton, who began the real study of modern science. It all comes from Newton, you see, whatever, the Principia and so on and so forth, you know. But again, we see the transfers every time, you see. And now the transfer is incredible. What's happening is that science is growing by leaps and bounds. We are going down, and science is growing by leaps and bounds. What I'm trying to show you is this transference. That is the churban of Tisha B'Av. It's not just the loss. What is so terrible is that all the wisdom, the Jewish wisdom, the spirituality of the Jews is given over by the Satan to the other side. And therefore we lose it, you see. I always like to say, if you want to experience churban, you know, once you understand these ideas, you know, take a trip to Harvard University. Harvard, it's the prince of all the colleges, you know, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, whatever, right? You ever look at a college? It's incredible. The buildings, the chokhmah, these guys are at the forefronts of knowledge. You see, what knowledge? We should have all that. We should have whatever Harvard has, right? We should have 10 times the amount that Harvard has in our sphere. Our sphere is Ruchnius, right? We should have that. But why do they have it and we don't? I always get a kick out of the fact, you ever look at a shul? You ever look at a college, the difference between a shul and a college? You know, how many times you walk in a shul, looks like it's right, the door's probably missing, or the window's broken or whatever. Well, you know, I remember in New Jersey, I went to pass a college called Monmouth University. You know, it's a nobody university, you know, but it's magnificent. It's got this humongous campus with these buildings and so on, you know. Yet when you look at the yeshiva, how many times the yeshiva, you know, it's all broken down. The guys are waiting to eat and there's no food around, right? I mean, you take a look at the difference between the Chochmas HaTorah and the Chochmas HaGoyim, even if it's about the physical world and so on. Because that's the Churban. The Churban is they're yoinik from our Chochmah. They are yoinik from our Tferes and Oiz. That's what they got. That's what Echo says. Sorel Makel Bagoyim. Ain't Torah. Why? Because the koich of the Torah is in the east and in the west. Right? And also the Nevi'im don't see anything anymore. You see? So the Nevi'im, which had the meditative arts, right? It now went to the east, and they're about meditation. And the Torah, which is the Chochmah of the Western zone, that's in the hands of the Western civilization. That's our stuff. That's the Tferes and the Oiz that they have. That's an incredible churban. And in the end, that's really what's called the Makibah Patash. It's one thing to lose the Beis Hamikdash. It's one thing to lose the Beis Hamikdash and the Torah itself. The Torah is in Golus and so on and so forth. It's another thing that they got it, and with it they try to influence so many Jews to drop the religion. The world should become atheistic. It's a whole different scenario. You see, that's Churban. And our problem is that we feed it, because it's all from us. That's the Oynish and so on. So this is a proper way to understand the concept of what Churban is. This whole concept of is that they have the wisdom that we used to have. They have the meditative arts, nevuah. They're into the meditation song, you see. They have the religions, and all of this basically ultimately takes Jews away to different, be either atheism or whatever. Where do you see this? In the Gemara. There's a very interesting Gemara, you know. There was somebody, I think it was Rabbi Yossi. He went into a churva. He was in one of the destructive places near the base of Mikdash. So he went in to daven Shemona Esrei. He comes out, and who's he facing? Eliyahu Novi. I mean, they were able to speak to him, you know. So Eliyahu Novi says, what are you doing in there? So the Gemara says, well, he says, because I had no place to daven, so I went to daven in the churva, you know. So Eliyahu Novi told him, he gave him a couple of halachas, says, you shouldn't have gone there, because the whole place can fall on you, number one. Then you're supposed to daven at Tefillah Ksara, whatever. But Eliyahu Novi asked him, interesting, he said, when you were in there, did you hear anything? Did you hear anything? Now he's talking to Rabbi Yossi, you know, he's not talking to one of us, you know, and so on, you know. So Rabbi Yossi says, yes, I heard. I heard a divine voice, a baskol, you know. And the baskol said, incredible statement, and the baskol is the divine voice. Every day there's a baskol that we cannot hear. You have to be a great man, Zeichel, Mourning Tzaddik, to hear the baskol. Where the baskol says, and this is what it says, woe is to me, God is saying, woe is to me, oily, woe is to me, that I have destroyed my house, my temple, and I have exiled my people among the nations of the world. God says this. So he heard that. So Rabbi Yossi said, yeah, I heard that baskol. Where God himself is expressing unbelievable anguish, agony, that he has sent his people among the nations of the world, which means what? Which is Golus. And Golus is what? It's either dispersion, right? Or persecution, or slaughter. That's really what it means. Just depends which level of Golus you're in, you know? So Eliyahu Novi says to him, I want to tell you something. Well, you heard that baskol, you heard it once, but that baskol comes out 3 times a day. What he was saying, it's continuous. Don't think it's once and that's it. It comes out every day, and it comes out 3 times a day. You see. What was Eliyahu really saying to him? What is this that God says, woe is to me, that I have destroyed my temple, my house, right? And that I have exiled my children among the nations of the world. What the Baruch is saying is this. There's 2 methods to do the tikkun. There's method A, which is the mitzvahs, right? But there's method B, which is the tshuva and the yisurin. What the Baruch is saying is that you people are still going to do the tikkun. That's not the problem. But why did you choose method B? Why? Method A is you do the mitzvahs. You do the mitzvahs, you have a Beis HaMikdash. There's unbelievable holiness in Torah all over Klal Yisrael. But instead what you do, right, you spoke Lashon Hara, right, and Sinas Chinam and all that. So what did I do? I had to take away method A, and I had to give you method B, which is what? Which is Golus. And God, who's the father of the Jews, has this incredible agony of which we cannot even understand. I mean, you talk about the Rebbe Hashem saying this, right? And of course we say Kaviyachol means if we could talk like that the Rebbe Hashem is in agony of which we cannot comprehend. Anguish, agony, suffering that the Jews are doing the tikkun through method B, which is that we have to go amongst the nations of the world. That's what the Rebbe Hashem is doing. See, but so of course, it doesn't mean we're not doing the tikkun. Don't get that, don't think that way. You can say, well, that's the end, because God has now left us. In fact, even Klal Yisrael Doniel thought that once we're in exile, we're now put from all the mitzvahs. No. It simply means that God said, until now, we're into method A, which is the mitzvahs, and tshuva. But now I have to bring you to method B. And therefore, this is the golus. But the Jews are still doing the tikkun. That's actually the nechama. That even though God left us, it doesn't mean he left us. What it means, he's put us into the 3rd device to do the tikkun, which is a very important concept, and that's part of the nechama, you see. But this is what the Baruch Hashem said. You see, where's the secret for this? You ever hear the paraduma? The red heifer? Why is there a red heifer? Now, I'm not going to explain it because even Shlomo Melech found it very hard to grasp. It was far from me and so on. But you know what the paraduma really is? I mean, what it signifies. There's a pasuk in Iyov where it says, "Umiyitein tohu mitomei." Who can bring out tahara from tumah? Only God. Tumah gives tumah. You can't bring purity out of contamination, out of pollution. That's the paraduma. The ashes of the paraduma represent the zoyhamah of the sun, because the ox is red, the shore is red, that's satanic, right? And we burn it, and we have ashes. The ashes of a paraduma represent the destruction of a satan, and it's mixed with mayim chaim, which is kedusha. So even God can dissolve the tumah, and that's, God can take purity, right? He can make pure even that which is from tumah. He can create purity, which is kedusha. That's the secret of the paraduma, and that's method B. The paraduma is the concept of method B, that Yesur itself, tumah, that kedusha, the suffering itself, can be the agent to bring back the geula itself, and that's the concept of the paraduma. That tahara, because when the kohen sprinkles the mechatos, the paraduma's ashes mixed with water, the person becomes tahor, and the kohen becomes tameh, which is, excuse me, you know, how could something create tahara and the person who sprinkles it becomes tameh? You see, because you can take tahara, a person can take tahara from tumah. That's what God does. But the kohen who sprinkles, he's what we'll call metapel. He engages in holding it. He becomes tameh because it's really tumah. But only God can bring tahara from tumah. Only God can save the Jews from all the incredible disasters and tragedies that have befallen the Jews. You see, and that's the concept really of the paraduma, and that's really what the Moshe does. But it's interesting. When Rabbi Akiva was dying, and he was dying in a brutal way, the Romans took an iron comb and they raked his back. They ripped his skin off, or whatever. It was a terrible way to die. So Rabbi Akiva was among the greatest sages who ever lived. Like without Rabbi Akiva, we would have nothing. So the Malachim, the Gemara brings the angels, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. These are Malachim, and they're very close to God. So they turned to the Rabbi and said, "What's happening? Zu Torah v'zu schora? This is the Torah, this is the reward you get for learning Torah?" We're talking about Rabbi Akiva. How do you put a man like Rabbi Akiva through incredible death and torture at the hands of the Romans? That's what they asked God, you see. So what did Rabbi Hashem say to them? Be quiet. If you ask me this question again, I will turn the entire world to Tohu V'Vohu. I will return it back into chaos. Now, what is that? That's a threat. I mean, is that the way Rabbi Hashem talks to Malachim? You know, if you ask me again, you know, I'm going to throw you guys out. Excuse me. They ask you a question, answer it. Why would Rabbi Hashem say that to them? If you ask me this again, you know, I'm going to turn the entire world back into gracious. So obviously they didn't ask the question again. But why would Rabbi Hashem talk like that? Right? God doesn't talk like that. He doesn't flex his muscles and says, "You can ask me again. I'm going to whack you." He doesn't do that, right? But the Moshe answered them. What was the answer? Because in order to take out tahara from tumah, you cannot reveal how it's done. Because if the Satan knows the mechanism of how tahara can take out tumah, how suffering can bring redemption, then the Satan will try to prevent it. So God said this, listen, I got a method B that can restore geula, redemption, even though there's incredible churban. I have my way. Now, you want to know the way, and that way is now being done to Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva is dying this horrible death, and in that death will be in that churban of Rabbi Akiva will be the redemption of Klal Yisrael. So the Rebbe Hashem said, you want to know how it works? Because that was the question. Zu Torah v'zu schora. This is the reward. This is the Torah, and this is the reward. which means that you guys want to have an explanation. You want to understand how I do this. How I can create churban, right? And from the churban comes redemption, which is exactly what's happened to Rabbi Akiva. So the Rosh says, if I tell you the answer, reveal the mystery, then the mystery will be out, and the Satan will know it, and he's going to try to prosecute not to make the Jews suffer, because he doesn't want that, you see. And therefore, if the Satan will get wind of it and know the answer, and he will now prosecute not to do the suffering, what will happen? The tikkun will never happen, so the world will be restored to chaos, because the tikkun doesn't happen. Rosh answered. It wasn't a strong arm tactic. You see, that is why we have churban, but the churban is what's called method B. This is what happens, you see. So the nechama is what? The nechama is that with churban is the Yeshua. In fact, that's what it says. Eis Tzara Yaakov. There's a time of suffering to Yaakov, tzaras, problems. Umimenu Yivashea, and from it he will be saved. You see, so you could learn. There's a terrible problem time suffering to Jacob, it's Klal Yisrael. Umimenu, but from that suffering he will be saved. No, what it means umimenu, and because of it he will be saved, because that's method B. See, that's the way it works. But to us it's unknown. We don't understand how can a Holocaust bring a redemption? When 6 million Jews died, we don't understand this. But for whatever reason, that's method B. Except we have no idea of how it works. And what is interesting is, even though we're fresh in Tisha B'Av, I need to tell you this idea, the concept of the nechama. In Shabbos Nachmu, which is going to be 2 weeks from now, right? That's the nechama, right? It says, Nachmu, Nachmu Ami. Be consoled, my people. Yes? Why is there a double expression of Nachmu? God doesn't stutter, right? So why does it say, be consoled, my people? Why is that? And the answer to that question is the nechama. When a person goes to prison, and he's there for 20 years, and all of a sudden the gates open and he's released. So that's a nechama. At least the suffering stopped. But if the person is really innocent, he can't live with the fact, I just wasted 20 years of my life. You see, why did I deserve to waste 20 years of my life? It's true, I'm very happy that I'm released, the guy says, right? But what about the 20 years I spent in prison? You know, why did that happen? There's no nechama. You see, and the Mendel says that in the end of time, the Jewish people, Knesset Yisrael, are going to stand in front of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Finally, that's the redemption. You know what they're going to ask him? They're going to say, okay, we suffered, and it's over, because that's the Geula. Thank God it's over, right? But why? Why was there a Holocaust, a Churban? Why were the Jews slaughtered for 2,000 years? Why? You see. So the second Nachmu. So Nachmu, be consoled, is that you're going to be released, the redemption. But the second Nachmu is God will explain what he couldn't tell the angels. And everybody's going to realize, and you know what they're going to say? Thank you for doing that. Because without the suffering, we could never have been redeemed. That's the concept. It's like the person who's sick. Without the surgery, he's finished. You see? So what he's going to do? Blame the doctor? What the Baruch shows is going to give 2 nechamos to Klal Yisrael. One is the redemption, that they're free. The second nechama, which Klal Yisrael wants, and only God can answer that. He's going to show them how every iota of suffering and pain was critically necessary for a person to be redeemed. And only God can do that, because he knows exactly, you see. So what God ultimately is going to do, he's going to reveal the secret, which he couldn't tell the angels. He's going to tell it to Klal Yisrael. And because he's going to explain to them everything, why did you put in your hand in your pocket and you wanted to come out with a quarter to feed the meter? Instead you came out with a nickel? Why did I have to experience that sorrow? Even that suffering he will explain why, because even that was ordained. And that is the great nechama of Klal Yisrael. That is the true consolation that the Jewish people will experience. they will not only be freed, which is the redemption, but they will know why all this had to happen. And in the end, they're all going to say, comes of a toivo, that this also was for the good, that if it wasn't for the suffering that we received, we could never have been redeemed. Nobody can give that consolation to the Jewish people except God, because He's the only one that knows exactly what He did, why He did it, to each individual neshama. That's what will happen in the end. That's the real nechama. And that's why Shabbos Nachmu comes right after, of course, Tisha B'Av. You see, not just to make us feel good, but to tell us that there is an answer, there is a nechama, and so on, So, what have I covered so far? I've explained to you the concept of churban. The first concept is what the loss was, that you cannot appreciate unless you know what Judaism looked like 2,000 years ago. And then you could mourn, because you could only mourn when you understand what the loss is. And the second thing I went to is a different dimension. There's a dimension of the absence of God, but there's another dimension that the absence of God feeds into the suffering that we as self receive. Because the Satan nourishes off that Shekhinah, as you see, the origin of religions. It nourishes off God, the Or Mashiach, and that's why you have the Chokhmah of the Goyim and so on, all from that, you see. And as a result of that, that's the Churban too, you see. I always say, if you want to experience Churban, go to Manhattan. Well, yeah, in Manhattan, I know what the equivalent is. No, what's an equivalent here? I say, go to Manhattan, go down Fifth Avenue, and just take a look at the magnificence of that civilization. We don't, because we live with this, it's no big deal. But the truth is, you walked over a guy who lived in 1740, and you projected him forward in time, to 2018, you'd have a heart attack. Because he couldn't possibly, conceptualize the unbelievable civilization, cars and smartphones, and like, what is this? It's unheard of, the technology, the way we live. We take it for granted, big deal, right? We open a refrigerator, put on the oven, big deal, right? Microwave. This didn't exist 300 years ago, When they had to wash laundry, they had to, wash the laundry with their hands. Today we don't have that. Today you just go to a laundromat, or you have a washing machine in your house. What's the big deal? You want to get on, you have to, order your horse or your camel. You know what I'm saying? You jump into your Lexus, whatever you have, right? And so on. This is the shock, many of what civilization. But in the end, this is our Tiferes Hanayos. That's what you're looking at. It's hard to imagine that. Could you imagine if we had never given the Tiferes Hanayos, if we had never given it to the Goyim? And one thing is interesting. Even the Goyim had to wait for the Or Mashiach. Think about that. The one who started science was Roger Bacon. He started the scientific method, you see. But that means that the Goyim never really had Chokhmah. They had to wait for the Or Mashiach to come down to the Jews to give them the science that the Satan would take. Even they had to wait for the Messianic light in order to understand anything, you see. And it's only when the Messianic light came down, right, that they can have their Chokhmah in terms of the physical universe and so on. Anyway, that's what the Churban is really all about, and so on. But what's important to remember is that Churban will ultimately turn into Geula. And that's why it says that the Mashiach ben David is born on Tisha B'Av. Does that mean he's really born on Tisha B'Av? No. What it does mean is that because we have mourned, therefore the schus of mourning for what we lost is what gives us the Mashiach. So born means that the merit of him coming is because of Tisha B'Av, because if we mourned, that means we understood our loss. So God says, if you really understand your loss, then I will come back, because you understand what you lost, you see. So that's what we have to keep in mind, is that we caused the destruction. Today, Friday, as I said, it was a judgment, we lost. Sinas Chinam, Lashon Hara, so they decided not to rebuild the temple. That means we contributed today to the destruction, because if we had not done these affairs, then the Gzer would be in some way, the mosque would be immediately removed, some political event, we just throw away the mosque. Yeah, it's nothing for the Russian to throw away that mosque, you know? And immediately, we would have had the process of bringing the redemption itself. And I'll just end with this, you know, that I say, Pokoi tifkoi, Pokoi pokadati, where God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, you know, I have surely remembered when the Russian was telling Moshe Rabbeinu, Pokoi pokadati, to take the Jews out, right? And that Lashon Pekido is the expression of Mashiach. You know, I have remembered, and therefore the time has arrived of the redemption, which is of course what Moshe Rabbeinu did. He was the Mashiach, and so on, you know. So the gematria of Pokoi Pokadati is 778. You see. But Pokoid is missing a Vav. Pokoid doesn't have a Vav, it's missing. You see? So therefore, the gematria of Pokoi Pokadati is 778. But if the Vav is missing, it's not part of the gematria, right? But since it's read, even though it's not written, it has to be part of the message. So Pokoi, the Vav is 6, which means the 6th millennium, which is 5,778. So let's hope that this year is the year, because that's the exact gematria of Pokoi Pokadati. And the Vav means the 6th millennium. 6th millennium, which of course is 5,000, 6th millennium, 778. So let's hope that this is the last Tisha B'Av, right? Or maybe there won't even be a Tisha B'Av, who knows, right? And the last Tisha B'Av, and that we should be zocher to the Gula really speedily in our days. Thank you.
We have a meeting for March.
Any questions? They don't matter.
If there's any questions, we'll take questions. Before as we do that, just want you to know, Rabbi will be here again on August 12th and again on August 26th.
Yeah.
Do you know that Friday night is the longest complete blood moon of the century? This Friday night.
It's going to be blood moon this Friday night?
This Friday night, the longest of the century.
How, you mean that's how long that will...
It will be for hours.
Blood moon. Will it be visible in Israel? It's interesting. I once gave a shiur about the blood moon. Remember that? The tetrad. 4 blood moons consecutively. You know, blood moon is in Yoel, you know that. It's in the Navi. Blood moon. Because it says in the Navi that I will turn the moon, I will block the sun and I will turn the moon red. That's what it says in the Navi. On the great day when I will come. It's messianic. So this is a blood moon. It's in Yoel. Take a look at Yoel. It's on Perek Gimel, Pasuk Dalet, where God says the blood moon. That is a sign of the redemption. But I didn't know that. It's interesting.
Rabbi, in reference to the destruction of the second base of Mikdash,
Yes.
when did Islam come into being?
When is what?
Islam. When did Islam come into being? Islam.
No. Well, Israel did not change.
Islam.
I got you.
Yeah.
Islam did not create a religion. They changed the prophecy that Muhammad is the greatest prophet, but they believe in one God. See? So that
But when did it come? When did it happen?
520, what is it, 570 CE? You know? Which, by the way, is when the real exile began for the Jews. That's when the real exile began. Because until then, you had the Jews were either Babylon, the Gemara, the Talmud, the Bavli, Yerushalmi, or they were in Israel. But the real exile really began, you know, when the Roman Emperor, you know, that's when the Jews really spread out and so on. At that time, Jews began to spread out all over the world.
So what's the relationship in Mida Keneged Mida then, in terms of, I don't know, let's just say, the manifestation of exile and the birth of Islam?
Well, again, because it's the same concept of being Yoinei, but since we didn't lose the Shekhinah, because there was no destruction of the temple, it had been destroyed 500 years earlier. You know what I'm saying? So what there was, in a certain sense, is not a change in religion, but a change in a lesser degree, a change in the prophet, where they claim that Muhammad is the last and greatest of the prophets. You see? So they didn't change what's called the Godhead. That they didn't do, because we didn't lose the Shekhinah. So why would that happen? See? It's only when we lose the Shekhinah, they get a new religion. See? Yeah? Anybody else?
When,
What?
when you say that science is from Or Mashiach
Yes,
for this physical world,
yes.
would it be correct to say that Hashem uses this in order for his own ends
Oh, yeah, of course.
to bring it?
Oh, yeah.
Without that, we wouldn't have 7 billion people on the planet.
Yeah,
supportable,
yeah.
sustainable.
Yeah, of course, God always, there's always what's called multi-determinism. It's always true that God uses many things for his purposes, even if it's satanic.
So you brought up an interesting point about that by the time of the destruction of the second Beit Hamikdash, there was a transference of Chachma
Yes,
from the Jews to the Goyim, right?
yes.
So what was the status of the Goyim prior to that? What was their purpose prior to that?
You're asking two different things, what their status is and what their purpose is,
Right, or their status? In other words, what was their mindset? What was their thinking
in terms of what?
before the destruction of the second Beit Hamikdash, when there was this transference of Chachma to them?
Well, they're mostly into paganism, you know, and science was basically Aristotle, which was wrong. Aristotle was
But that
wrong.
only came about at the time of the destruction of the second Beit Hamikdash. Prior to that, well,
Greek philosophy started around the time of the destruction of the Beit Hamikdash. So they, you either had the Greek Chochmah, right, and the Romans adapted the Greeks because basically that's really what it was. That was their status.
no, but I mean, prior to that, like, time of the first Beit Hamikdash, or during the time of the second before the destruction.
Well, it was all myth, paganism, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they were able to do things, and so on and so forth. But I would never call it the beginning of the modern age. People credit Greek Chochmah as the beginning of the modern age. They credit Alexander the Great as the one because he's the one who spread Greek Chochmah throughout the whole world because he conquered everything, But the modern civilization starts from Greece. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they all lived right around the time of the second Beit Hamikdash, But even then, there was no such thing as experimentation, really. It was only until Roger Bacon said this is ridiculous. So he created what's called the scientific method. The hypothesis and experimentation. So they got away from the armchair of Chochmah of Aristotle. That's when science really took off. Then when Newton came along, pretty shut up. Yeah,
So, for the upside down Y,
the upside down why.
so it seems a little unfair. We have Satan, which is a spiritual force, then you have people.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not quite, the competition is a little bit off.
Not really, you know why?
Why?
Because your equation is wrong. You're right that you have something on one side.
Yeah,
Who do you have on the other?
you have the Jews on the other side.
No, you have the neshama on the other. And the neshama is greater than the Satan. It's not just a man. You're talking about a divine neshama. That's a chelik l'kanimah. That's part of living God. That's pretty good.
Is that about the individual neshama or
Yeah.
Klal Yisrael?
Well, even as an individual, it's incredibly powerful. As Klal Yisrael, you can't beat it. The Satan has to work overtime, triple overtime, in order to get a Jew to sin. But the neshama is greater than the Satan. I have a whole shir on that really the Satan should be beat every moment. If not for the fact that a person can justify and rationalize a behavior that he wants to do. Without that power, there's a whole thing, but the neshama is much greater than the Satan. The problem is that the Satan, he'll use his wiles in any way in order to get the neshama to sin. So you're more powerful than the Satan. The one is why everybody's following the Satan. Yeah.
In the case of like the Chachma being spread to the east for the Eastern religions,
Yes.
why is that a bad thing that would be a proliferation of wisdom?
No, well, that in itself is not bad. The problem is when it's directed against the Jews, then it becomes bad. You see, Chochmah in itself is not bad, but that's not one. But if the Satan is the one who's transferring it, he's not interested in bettering human society. It couldn't care less. Whenever the Satan does anything, it's always in reference to the Jews. Why? Because the Jews are the only one who could do the tikkun. The only one who can kill the Satan are the Jews. So what does he care about everybody else? So whatever he does will always be that either then or at a later date. See the concept of science, right? At that point in time was okay. But that is responsible for the growth of atheism. Then along comes Darwin, right? And then you can become an Epicurus. Why not? Because now you have an answer. You can explain things without having to reference God, you see? But it's always in reference to the Jews. You see what I'm saying? Yeah? What?
The creation of Eastern religion was to bring Jews to be spiritual without mitzvot, for example.
The creation of what?
The purpose of Eastern religions
Yeah?
was, the second purpose was to create a way for Jews to be spiritual without keeping the mitzvot.
Yeah?
Because they have some spirituality in them.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, that's what the, Buddhism or the, I mean, if you look at their thoughts, they're not ritualistic. Most of these religions of these have no rituals, unless that was later on put in. But the belief itself is fundamentally that, like Buddhism, the main thing is to avoid, to divest yourself of all physicality. And that's what they used to do, And that will be a substitute for religion. The concept of a monastery is not Jewish. Judaism wants you to interact with the world and to do a mitzvah using the world, because you need to transform the world into a spiritual entity, the dimension. You see what I'm saying? Whereas Christians believe in a monastery. It means you can leave the world and go to some far off mountain, but that's not what Jews do. Jews, the concept of 613 commandments is totally involved in the physical world. Every mitzvah is a physical world, tray for meat, truma, mice of the field, The Jewish religion is fundamentally ritualistic, that it has to have a physical act. Why? Because you're supposed to turn the physical world into a spiritual. Whereas other religions don't need that. You see, they're just, we gotta grow the soul, So, so the yogis will contemplate their navel, whatever these guys do, and you have Buddha and Confucius, although Confucius is not really a religion, it's more proper behavior, this kind of stuff, But the other religions are belief in all kinds of deities, but they get away from rituals. They just want to do the meditation and so on. Anybody else?
I've got one question.
Yes. Wow.
If we spoke about religions from the East, and you have
Yes.
Hinduism, which I think yoga is connected, or
Yeah, but Hinduism is classic paganism.
which
Well, it's a trinity.
Hinduism.
Whatever the trinity
Hinduism,
gods.
but how does it, for example, it's very popular for people to practice yoga in all sorts of
Yeah, okay.
clubs and things like
Yeah,
for
okay.
their- for
But
their-
that's for the exercises.
for the exercise.
Half the yoga. That's
So there's nothing wrong with it.
well, if you're doing it
What
just,
do
if you're doing a bodily position,
Yeah.
in order to strengthen the body, it would seem to be okay.
Because I heard that in Los Angeles, for example, they have these studios where they actually put a statue in front
Oh yeah,
of the
yeah,
lady,
that
and they say
yeah.
all sorts of words that were
Yeah,
very
Om. They
strange.
can meditate on OM, Om,
Oh,
universal vibration.
Yeah. And so is that
Yeah,
how
it
that's
could be look, it could be in a Avodah Zarah, of course.
Yeah.
You meditate on universal consciousness. Yeah,
I mean, for
but
a practicing Jew, who wants to be close to Hashem, he would keep away from at least the verbal expressions of that.
yeah, all you do is the exercise. You're not into the meditation.
Right. Well, you might as well do exercise, any kind of.
Yeah, get on a treadmill.
That's a good.
You know
Physical bed that we mentioned.
what?
Physical bed that we mentioned.
Yes.
One, is it supposed to be rebuilt before 6,000 or after 6,000?
Before,
So when Mashiach comes, then it's rebuilt.
yes.
And it's going to be actually physical, and
Oh yeah, it's gonna be a real building.
we will build it, or we're going to actually.
Well, that's machlekes, but it seems to be half and half. We build the foundation, and God brings it down from heaven.
So
It's a miraculous event.
So it's supposed to, like the Mashiach, then the Bet HaMikdash, and then it's, how long is it supposed to last?
What, the Beis Hamikdash?
Yeah.
Until the end of 6,000, in which place we will all ascend, and we'll have the Beis Hamikdash L'mayla. Because there's another Beis Hamikdash up there that corresponds. Yeah.
And it's only, so it's a short period, so it's 6,000.
No, but the real Beis Hamikdash is a spiritual one.
And that will come after 6,000.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's already after Mashiach. Mashiach himself ends at the end, 6,000. And then begins the process of Olam Haba. The future world is a whole different
And
scenario.
there we have a spiritual memory. But the physical
Yeah.
one comes before 6,000,
Yes.
and then the
Yeah.
spiritual one.
Yeah, sure.
I thought you said Olam Haba was
Olam Haba was what?
here.
It is here, but it's not in its form. It's Olam Hazeh. You know, after 6,000 years, when the Mashiach period ends, that's when this world begins to become transformed. See? You know.
And how did the Jew destroy the Sultan exactly, not speaking Lashon Hara?
Well, the major thing, which is, you bring up a good point, the major way to destroy the Sultan, and that's what he hates, is be very careful with Shmir Saloshim. Because that's what opens up the judgment.
What is that?
Lashon Hara. No slander.
What was the second, there was a second thing too that we also.
Who?
The second way we destroyed basically, there's two terms you
Sinas Chinam.
Yeah, what is that?
Baseless hatred. But when you talk Lashon Hara, that creates baseless hatred. They're brother and sister. That's really what they are, you see. That's the major, and that will bring the Beis Hamikdash. The Jews will stop talking Lashon Hara and stop hating one another, you know, and there's so much of that, then the Beis Hamikdash will be built.
In regards to the power of the Sultan, if you say at nighttime, the Shema Al-Hamikah,
Yeah, well,
does
that's,
that do anything for protection?
yes, it does, sure. Yeah.
Individually or for Klal Yisrael, just for yourself? You say
Well, basically for yourself, yeah.
just for yourself, and
yeah.
that can help it.
Yeah, but whenever you do something yourself, since you really Klal Yisrael is one block, it also always helps the Jewish people. You know, it's always it's a public thing, you know. Okay.
Yitzhak,